June 12, 1943, North Atlantic Ocean. A ship full of captured German soldiers cuts through the fog, heading west. No one on board knows exactly where they're going. Some whisper of forced labor, others fear starvation or worse. But when they finally see the American coastline, what happens next leaves them speechless. Instead of cruelty, they find kindness. Instead of punishment, they're given pay. Imagine being a soldier who fought against a nation, and then getting paid by that very nation to work, and even send money back home to your family in Germany. How could that be possible in the middle of World War II? This is the true story of the German POWs who couldn't believe what America did for them, and how it changed their lives forever. If you love real, forgotten World War II stories that reveal the human side of war, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and stay till the end, because this one will make you see the war from a side history books rarely show. Now, let Tebs begin. Lieutenant Karl Fischer, 26 years old, once the commander of a Panzer III, sat against a steel bulkhead with his canteen cupped in both hands. He could still feel the sting of desert wind and remember the blinding light of Tunisia, where his unit had finally surrendered to the British. He had expected the worst, perhaps a prison in England, or a labor camp somewhere in Canada, but America, it seemed unthinkable. When the ship finally pulled into port, the first thing Karl noticed was color. The docks of Norfolk, Virginia, stretched in endless lines of cranes and cargo, all in motion. Trains rumbled, forklifts beeped, and American soldiers in pressed uniforms shouted orders he couldn't understand. Everything felt alive, industrial, unstoppable. The prisoners were lined up and marched ashore. Their guards, armed but relaxed, didn't bark or shove them. Instead, a sergeant with a soft southern drawl handed each man a paper tag, name, rank, and a camp number, printed neatly in English. "Welcome to the States, boys," he said almost casually. "Follow the line." The Germans exchanged bewildered looks. There were no dogs, no rifle butts, no humiliation, just efficiency. Karl had prepared himself for anger and revenge from the victors, but what he saw instead was order and discipline. Hours later, after a long train ride through rolling green farmland, the prisoners arrived at Camp Concordia, Kansas, a sprawling facility of neat barracks, barbed wire, and guard towers. The Kansas sky stretched endlessly above them. That evening, Karl stood in the chow line, still wearing his faded Afrika Korps tunic. The scent of food drifted from the mess hall. Fresh bread, beans, meat. He thought it must be for the Americans. But when he reached the counter, a U.S. Army cook with a cigarette tucked behind his ear handed him a full metal tray and said, "Eat up, pal. You're in America now." Karl stared at the meal. Mashed potatoes, stew, even a slice of pie. It was the first warm food he'd had in months. Around him, his fellow POWs hesitated, as if expecting a trick, but soon the clatter of spoons filled the hall. One of the guards laughed softly. "You boys look like you haven't eaten in years." Karl looked up, chewing slowly. He didn't know what to say. In the distance, an American flag fluttered over the camp gate. For the first time since his capture, he felt something unfamiliar, confusion mixed with relief. The next morning, an officer gathered them in the yard. He spoke through an interpreter. "You will work here. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will receive wages, 50 cents a day." The crowd stirred. "Wages?" One man repeated in disbelief. "Yes," the interpreter said with a small smile. "You are prisoners, not slaves." Karl turned toward his friend, Oberkofreiter Weber. "They're paying us?" he whispered. Weber shrugged, just as stunned. They didn't understand it yet, but this was the beginning of something they'd talk about for the rest of their lives. How the enemy they'd been told was barbaric would treat them with a kind of fairness that Germany itself had forgotten. Outside the wire, Kansas farmers were already waiting. The harvest was near, and American manpower was stretched thin. Soon these German soldiers, men trained to destroy, would find themselves in fields of wheat, earning pay from the country they had come to conquer. July 1943, near Concordia, Kansas. The morning sun climbed over the plains, washing the horizon in gold. Trucks rumbled down dusty farm roads as German prisoners, clad now in faded khaki work uniforms marked with PW in black letters, sat in the back watching endless rows of wheat ripple like water. Lieutenant Carl Fischer sat beside a handful of fellow POWs, including Weber and 2 young infantrymen from Bremen, who had never seen farmland this vast. They spoke quietly, wondering aloud whether the Americans would watch them with rifles or whips. When the truck stopped beside a wooden barn, a man in overalls and a straw hat approached, broad-shouldered, perhaps in his 40s. He introduced himself simply as Mr. Henderson, a Kansas farmer whose sons were fighting in Europe. "Morning, boys," Henderson said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You help me with harvest. I'll make sure you sucker fed right. Deal?" Carl hesitated, unsure whether to answer. The interpreter stepped in, translating the farmer Sip's words. The men nodded silently. Henderson smiled. "All right then, let Sips get to work." They were handed scythes, pitchforks, and burlap sacks. The guards stayed back, rifles slung lazily, more interested in the shade than in intimidation. Within minutes, the sound of work filled the field, metal slicing grain, the thump of boots, the whistle of wind. Carl had never done farm labor before. His palms blistered quickly, sweat soaking through his shirt. But after weeks of confinement and transport, the open air felt like freedom. And when Henderson's wife brought out a jug of lemonade and sandwiches at midday, the prisoners stared in disbelief. "Eat," she said kindly, handing out the food. "You'll soul work better if you soared not starving." Carl took the sandwich with trembling fingers. It was made of thick white bread and cold ham, luxuries unimaginable in wartime Germany. Weber grinned, biting into his, and whispered, "If this is captivity, I don't ever want to escape." By the end of the day, Carl Sip's muscles burned, but Henderson clapped him on the shoulder. "You did fine work today, son." Later, back at camp, the men received paper chits canteen credits, the guard explained. Each was worth 50 cents, redeemable for small comforts, chocolate, cigarettes, soap, even postcards. When Carl entered the camp store for the first time, he froze. Shelves stacked with goods, things Germans hadn't seen in years, filled the room. A POW clerk greeted him politely. "You can even send money home," he said, "through the Red Cross." That night, under the humming light of the barracks, Carl sat at a wooden table, writing his first letter home in months. His handwriting shook as he began. "My dearest Anna, you will not believe this, but they pay us here. We work on farms, and they treat us fairly. I eat more here than our people do in Hamburg. I hope you and little Lucas are safe. I will send what I can through the Red Cross." He folded the paper carefully, sealing it with a trembling hand. Across the room, another prisoner strummed a guitar, an instrument somehow built from scrap wood and wire. Someone began to hum an old folk tune. The sound floated out into the Kansas night, over barbed wire and watchtowers, mixing with the chirp of crickets and the distant whistle of a train. In that moment, it was easy to forget they were enemies. The guards outside leaned against the fence, listening too. One of them, a young sergeant from Ohio, whispered to another, "Doesn't sad sound like the men who bombed London, does it?" The other guard just shook his head. "War's a funny thing." And for Carl Fischer, former Panzer officer, sworn enemy of the United States, it was the first night he truly believed that perhaps the world he'd known was not the only one possible. October 1943, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The autumn wind carried the scent of dry grass and wood smoke. The harvest season had ended, and the German prisoners now worked in small factories and workshops set up within the camp, repairing farm equipment, sewing uniforms, and cutting lumber for the local mills. Carl Fischer, once a soldier of the Afrika Korps, now spent his days behind a workbench assembling tractor engines. The clang of wrenches and the rhythmic hiss of air tools replaced the noise of war. It was strange, he thought, to be surrounded by industry again, but this time not in service of destruction. Each week they received their wages, paper credits recorded neatly in ledgers guarded by the U.S. Army and monitored by the Red Cross. Some men bought luxuries, cigarettes, razor blades, postcards. Others pooled their earnings to send small remittances home, where their families lived among the rubble of German cities. Karl received his first reply from Anna in December. The letter was short, written on thin gray paper. "Dearest Karl, we received your money. Lucas needed shoes. The shops are empty here. But your letter gave me hope. I pray for your return. Stay safe. The war cannot last forever." He read the words again and again, tracing them with his fingers. Around him, other men received similar letters, mothers, wives, sisters, thanking their captured sons for the money that kept them alive. It seemed unthinkable. They had come to America as defeated enemies, yet their labor here now fed the families they'd left behind in a nation still at war. The camp itself had begun to change, too. The guards no longer shouted. The prisoners no longer marched with stiff precision. On Sundays, the Americans allowed them to play soccer on the open field. Farmers and local families sometimes watched from outside the fence. Children perched on car hoods, laughing as the Germans cheered their teams. Weber, once a cynical corporal, became a favorite among the guards for his sense of humor. He learned to say, "Howdy," in a perfect Kansas drawl, which never failed to make them laugh. One afternoon, Karl was working in the machine shed when Mr. Henderson arrived at the camp gate, hat in hand. He had come to thank the prisoners for helping with his harvest. "They saved my farm," he told the commandant. "And they worked hard, harder than I've ever seen." He looked through the wire at the familiar faces and raised a hand. "I still be needing them again next season. If you sit law it." The gesture struck Karl deeply. Here was an American farmer, whose own sons were fighting the same German army Karl had once served, standing outside a prison camp to thank his enemies. That night, Karl wrote again to Anna. "They say America is full of machines, but that's not what amazes me. It's the people. They fight hard, but they do not hate. They work as if the world depends on it, and maybe it does." Weeks later, Christmas came. The Americans erected a tree in the camp square, decorated with tinsel made from scrap foil. They even brought in a small organ from a nearby church. The Germans sang carols softly at first, then louder, voices echoing into the cold night. Guards stood listening, some joining in with Silent Night, the shared melody bridging two languages. Snow began to fall, gentle and quiet. Karl closed his eyes and imagined home. Anna, Lucas, the ruined streets of Hamburg covered in white. He could almost hear her voice as the song faded into silence. He had never imagined that dignity could survive captivity. Yet here, in the heart of his enemy's country, he found it being rebuilt, one small act of fairness, one paid day's labor at a time. May 1945, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The spring air carried a strange quiet across the camp. The war in Europe was over. The prisoners heard it first from the guards, then over the crackling camp loudspeakers. Germany has surrendered. For a long time, no one spoke. Some men stood frozen. Others sank to their knees. A few wept openly, not only for defeat, but for relief that the killing was finally over. Lieutenant Karl Fischer stood by the fence, staring into the distance. The wheat fields outside were alive again, golden under the Kansas sun, just as they had been when he first arrived 2 years earlier. Only now, he was no longer the same man. That evening, the camp commandant, a stocky, silver-haired officer named Captain Lewis, assembled the men in the yard. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "the war is finished. You are no longer enemies. You are men who have endured much, and who will soon return home." There was applause, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. Over the following weeks, preparations began for repatriation. The POWs repaired their uniforms, packed their meager belongings, and took final photographs with the guards, men who had once watched them from towers now standing shoulder to shoulder for keepsakes. Karl returned to Mr. Henderson's Sept farm one last time under escort. The old farmer met him with a handshake. "Never thought I'd say this," Henderson admitted. "But you boys did good work. You helped us when we needed it most." Karl looked down, unsure how to answer. "You helped us too," he said quietly. "You showed us what decency looks like." Henderson smiled faintly. "Maybe that's how wars ought to end." Back in camp, Carl used his last pay to buy a small leather-bound notebook from the canteen. In it, he began to record everything he had seen: the work, the wages, the kindness, and the contradictions. He titled it simply, America, 1943-45. When the day of departure came, hundreds of German POWs boarded the same kind of trains that had once brought them to Kansas. Only now the guards waved as the engines started. Some of the Americans handed out chocolate bars, others cigarettes. Safe travels, one shouted. No hard feelings. Dotto 60. Carl pressed his hand against the train window, watching the camp fade into the horizon. Months later, he stepped off a ship in Bremerhaven, Germany. The docks were unrecognizable, ruins stretching for miles, smoke still rising from the wreckage of cities. Children scavenged for coal among the rubble. In the gray silence of post-war Germany, Carl reached into his coat pocket and felt the notebook. Inside were his wages receipts, Red Cross letters, and a photograph of him and Weber standing beside an American farmer's tractor, smiling like old friends. That night, reunited with Anna and Lucas in a bomb-damaged apartment, he told them everything: how they'd been paid, how they'd eaten well, how the enemy had treated them not with vengeance, but with humanity. Anna listened, holding his hand. "Do you think they'll believe you?" she asked, softly. Carl shook his head. "Maybe not, but I still remember. And maybe Lucas will too." Outside, church bells rang for the first time since the war had ended. Carl walked to the window and looked out over the ruined street, the faint chime echoing through the city. He realized then that the true battle had never been for land or pride. It had been for the kind of world that would follow. And somehow, in a prison camp half a world away, he had already seen a glimpse of what that world could be. The story of the German POWs who were paid to work in America would fade quietly into history, overshadowed by battles and politics. But for the men who lived it, for Carl, Weber, and thousands like them, it remained one of the war's strangest, most humbling truths, that even behind barbed wire, humanity can survive the fire of war.